למען ציון לא אחשה, ולמען ירושלים לא אשקוט.
You are listening to Hebrew Voices with Nehemiah Gordon. Thank you for supporting Nehemiah's McCore Hebrew Foundation. Learn more at nehemiahswall.com.
Shalom, this is Nehemiah Gordon with Hebrew Voices. I am here in southern Jerusalem with Dr. Miriam Brand, the author of a book which talks about the source of sin. And actually the title is Evil Within and Without, the Source of Sin and Its Nature as Portrayed in Second Temple Literature. This is going to be exciting. Shalom, Dr. Brand.
Shalom. I'm happy to be here, and it's nice to hear such an excited introduction.
I am excited, but I want to read your little bio here, which I call a little bio, but it's very impressive. Miriam Brand holds a PhD in Bible and Second Temple Literature from New York University and an MA in Bible from Haifa University. She's written a book on the portrayal of sin in the Second Temple period. That's the book I'm holding in my hand, a beautiful book that you can get on Amazon.com and other places. Evil Within and Without, as well as a commentary on the Book of Enoch. We're going to have you back at some point to talk about the Book of Enoch, maybe even the Enoch calendar. That's a separate topic. She has taught at New York University, Stern College, Brown University, and has spoken at Hebrew University, Matan, Bar-Ilan, Cambridge University, and the University of Kiel in Germany. She is currently an associate fellow at the Albright Institute of Archaeological Research. All I can say is wow. Let's dive into it. Let's talk about sin. What is the source of sin?
Okay, so really what I worked on was how people were explaining the source of sin in Second Temple literature. In other words, this is literature, this is after the Hebrew Bible is essentially, well, from the traditional point of view, it's after the Hebrew Bible is closed, even though how closed it is for people living during the Second Temple period is, of course, a question.
And let me just point out that you're an Orthodox Jew, but today really you're speaking as a scholar. Right. Meaning whatever your personal beliefs are, today you're speaking as an academic.
Right. Well,
right?
Yes. I mean, actually, it's pretty easy, I think, for an Orthodox Jew to be a scholar without a bias in Second Temple literature because it's after the closing of the Hebrew Bible as it's...
Okay. Whereas if we were, let's say, talking about, I don't know, the authorship of the Torah, then we might get into some theological landmarks.
That's right. There you have like issues that you either have to deal with or you need to ignore or things like that. For me,
but here there's not much of an issue.
Okay. At least for me, there isn't. It depends how you see Orthodoxy, I guess. But so what's interesting in Second Temple literature is that this is when people start trying to explain a side of theodicy that...
Whoa.
Okay, theodicy.
Big word alert. Okay. What is a theodicy? I know what a theodicy is. Actually, I'm not even sure after talking to you I know what it is. Tell us what theodicy is.
Theodicy literally simply means the justification of God, right? So the idea is, and what the question of theodicy is usually set up as is, if there is a God who is all-powerful, all-knowing, and benevolent, right? Usually the second part that we think of is, then why do bad things happen to good people, right? Because
and I think that's the layman's definition of theodicy, isn't it? Why do bad things happen to good people?
Right. Now, of course, other things bother people, like why do good things happen to bad people is sometimes something that people are distressed about.
And that's also part of theodicy.
Yeah, it really actually kind of is, even though it's a little less troubling.
Can you spell theodicy for us?
Theodicy.
Okay, that's homework, people. Go look that up. But that's actually... you may not know the word, but it's something that people struggle with throughout their lives. I heard an interesting lecture from Bart Ehrman, who is an agnostic, and he actually says the reason he's an agnostic is because bad things happen to good people. So whether you know this term or you don't, this is something people throughout the world, throughout history have been struggling with.
Yeah, all sorts of through Middle Ages, early modern period. This is something major that really concerns people up till today. And another aspect of theodicy that starts bothering people during the Second Temple period is, if God created me and God doesn't want me to sin, then why do I want to sin? Right? When I'm teaching undergrads, they're like, because sin is fun. I said, yes, but why? But why is sin fun? It's bothering people. If God doesn't want me to sin and God created me, then why is sin so much fun? Or essentially, why do I want to sin? And this is something that you can find. I'm not saying you can't find perhaps answers to in the Hebrew Bible, but it's not a question that's bothering anyone. You understand? Like if you look for an answer, you have kind of this oracular pronouncement to Cain that sin is crouching at the door but it desires you, but you can still have the upper hand, right? So
that's what is that in Genesis 4? where God says, he says, La petach chatat
La
rovetz.
petach chatat rovetz.
Sin is
Yeah.
crouching at the door.
Yeah.
And basically, if you can overcome it, you don't have to sin. It's the choices in your hands.
That's
but what you're
right.
saying is it doesn't explain why sin is, lusting after Cain and wanting to
Right.
cause him to sin.
Right.
Okay.
And it doesn't seem to bother anyone until the Second Temple period, where all of a sudden people are saying, wait, so why do I want to sin at all?
Mhm.
And they come up with some explanations which are not necessarily particularly satisfying,
Mhm.
but however, in whatever manner it satisfies them.
Okay. Well,
yeah.
and I'm also thinking of the verse in Genesis where it talks about the thoughts or the plans of man are sinful
yes.
from evil from his youth, and so
Right.
but what you're saying is that's being stated as a fact. It doesn't ask the
Exactly.
question, why is it so?
Right,
Okay.
right. So that's the thing, is that we have numerous things that have to do with sin in the Bible that are kind of just put out there without an issue. So if I can just go off topic for a
Sure.
second to talk about, in the Bible, it talks about how God punishes future generations for sin.
Yeah.
Now that's been interpreted numerous ways, and probably what it originally meant is that God doesn't necessarily doesn't wipe someone out because of his sin. He kind of metes out the punishment over several generations.
Okay.
However, that's something that starts bothering people. Well, I shouldn't say starts bothering. That's a problem in, let's say, it's an explanation of things in Kings, and it's a problem in Jeremiah and in Ezekiel.
Right, like Ezekiel 18 talks about that.
Right.
And he basically qualifies it, as I understand it, that yes, you bear your father's sin if you continue in his sin.
Well,
but if you
Ezekiel
repent, then...
doesn't even say that. Ezekiel he says yes if you continue. Because everyone's, essentially, Ezekiel's setup is you are punished for your sin and for your present sin. In other words, if you were righteous yesterday and you're a sinner today, you're in trouble today.
Right.
And that's Ezekiel's thing, whereas Jeremiah, very interestingly, says, well, yeah, that's the way things work now, but in the Messianic age, in the future, it's not going to be that way anymore. Everyone's just going to be punished for their own sin, which is interesting because they use the same quote also to talk about this. So whereas this is taken as in Kings, it's used as an explanation for why do bad things happen to good people, because his grandfather sinned, right?
Yeah.
And for Jeremiah and Ezekiel, this is a theological problem. So it's interesting to me when something becomes a theological problem. Okay. And the source of sin is a theological problem really in Second Temple texts. So they come up with, I really kind of divided my book this way, and that does already set the stage. When you already say, this is how I'm going to categorize my texts, you're already getting to a certain answer, unfortunately. Okay. But I just had to have a way to categorize this huge number of texts I was looking at. Just to give you an idea, I was looking at the Dead Sea Scrolls and I was looking at Philo.
Wow.
Philo, yeah.
Each one of those could be a doctorate.
Yes. I did my doctorate. My advisor was a person with big ideas, and I like having big ideas, and he did not rein me in.
Okay.
And then there came a point where I said, well, gee, really, I'm dealing with a lot of Judean texts. Should I really be dealing with Philo, who is a Jewish philosopher in Alexandria towards the end of the Second Temple period?
Okay.
And he's really coming with, kind of Neoplatonic ideas. And he's like, no, you have to do Philo, because if you don't do Philo, how can your book be a reference for anyone who wants to look up sin in the Second Temple period?
So the objective was for it to be the definitive work on sin in the Second Temple period.
Well, I guess for my advisor it was.
Okay. So now, as the definitive answer, what is the issue of sin in this? Like, what is the source of sin? And I think when we talked, you'd mentioned that there's really basically two approaches. One, there's the whole question of demons. Right. And then there's the Yetzer Hara, or evil inclination. Right. So or are there other ones as well?
Well, those are really the kind of the main thing, because we're talking about, is it a human and internal cause, or is it a demonic sort of external cause? Because the demons sometimes can go into you. Now, what's interesting is that a demon almost never, you almost say almost, you can't say never ever, but almost never in a Jewish text, an extant text of this period.
Extant in plain English means it still exists.
Yeah. Okay. In other words, because we don't know
what we don't
was
have.
Lost.
Right.
Yeah. But the demons don't completely possess a person. You don't have someone who's doing something because...
Let's back up. Yeah. Do we have any reference to demons in the Tanakh? In the Old Testament?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, we do. Well, we have kind of references just by name to Lilith, to Resheph. We also have...
But as far as demons and demonic possession, do we have that?
I would say no. I would say no.
So when you're talking about demonic possession, that's really outside of the Tanakh.
It's certainly outside of the Tanakh. Okay. And it's also outside of Jewish Second Temple literature, but we have it in the Gospels.
Okay. So the
That's
New Testament,
interesting.
You're saying the New Testament is the first time we have demonic possession in any Jewish literature?
I don't like to say only, and I'm sure someone
Okay.
can say, no, I found it. And we do
Yeah.
have texts that talk against demons. So I'm
Okay.
not saying that no one is
So what
seeing
is the
demon
function of
possessing.
those demons in
But
these
okay, so
other Jewish
so
sources?
so other Jewish sources, their demons cause disease. Demons can cause sin, can cause you to sin.
Like, what's
There-
an example of one of those sources?
What are the demons causing sin?
Yeah,
Okay, so why don't I give you a range?
sure.
Okay, so there are prayers. Prayers of this period tend to be more deterministic. What I mean is, in this case, is that when you pray, you're more likely to say, "Oh God, help me not sin. I can't do it on my own."
Okay,
Right? You're giving the power to God.
okay,
And part of that language a lot of times makes it sound like I have no control over what I do.
okay.
Right? That's
So that's what
like,
you mean by deterministic.
in this case,
Okay.
yeah, that's what I mean.
And where do
Um,
we find that kind of in the
So,
Dead Sea
for
Scrolls?
example, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, we have a lot of prayers from the Dead Sea Scrolls. So some of those prayers actually talk about demons, and they're like, the demons inside me are fighting with the laws that you put inside me.
Wow.
And they're clearly expressing this kind of almost kind of psychological conflict that we would say today it's a psychological conflict, right? And they're
Okay.
saying there are demons inside me that are fighting against the laws that you've put inside me, and I need you, God, to help me overpower them, or you, God, have given me the power to overpower them. It's with you.
So
Yeah.
so you have that in the Dead Sea Scrolls. How is that different than demonic possession? Let's say in the Gospels. In the New
Okay,
Testament?
so you're not. What you can't say is you can't say a demon took over my limbs and made me do this thing.
Okay.
Which is exactly what you see in the Gospels, right?
Okay.
Demons, they can go into pigs and make them all run into the water, which is clearly against their,
Mhm.
self-interest. And it's not what. And I'm not saying that belief didn't exist, because we have all sorts of incantations against demons.
Okay.
So I'm not going to say that no one believed that, but what we have in terms of prayers or descriptions of what demons do, they don't describe. So when we do have, for example, we have the demon Belial, who's a very popular demon for the Qumran community.
Mhm.
And in
Popular meaning they're concerned with him, not that
they don't like him.
They hate him.
They hate him. They hate him, but they talk about him a
they
lot.
talk about him a lot.
They talk about him a lot. And he's kind of you could call him kind of a Satan character. And they divide humanity, as it were, into the lot of God and the lot of Belial. At least they do that in the community rule.
Yeah.
And of course, they are the lot of God, and the people who oppose them are the lot of Belial. In the introduction to the community rule, they talk about Belial. They don't actually talk about Belial himself so much. They curse the people who follow Belial.
Mm.
They curse the people who are of the lot of Belial, even though we have an independent text, which is very similar, and also a curse/blessing text, where they curse Belial and his demons.
Now,
themselves.
Belial is mentioned even in the book of Deuteronomy, but there it's not referring to a demon.
Right.
It's usually translated as either worthless or those without yoke.
Yeah,
Those are the
yes,
two
right. So those are two explanations. Probably worthless is closer, just in terms of the.
But
the
later on,
linguistic.
it actually takes on the understanding of this sentient being, like a
Right.
demon
And that's
messing with people.
Yeah, and that's in the second temple period. So we see the
Okay.
word a lot in Bible, but never to mean. And see, we see the word. See, what leads to this interpretation is that we have the phrase "anshe Belial," people of. Really, what it means is worthless people, people who are not acting appropriately, is what it means.
Yeah.
And what it's read as later are people of Belial, the people who follow this demon
Okay.
Belial. So when a Qumran community member says Anshe Belial, people of Belial, he means the people who follow the demon
Right.
Belial.
So basically, we have this demon in the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Right. Oh, but let
And-
me just add one
Yeah,
more thing.
sure.
When in the introduction to the Damascus document, which is another rule book of the community
Of the
uh,
Dead Sea Scrolls
of the Dead-
community or
Yeah,
Essenes, whoever you
yeah,
identify
yeah,
them as.
right. So-
Let's
so-
not get into that. whoever
Right,
they are.
right. There's a whole discussion, and my teacher actually said that they weren't Essenes. They're all sorts. I could go
Okay.
into that too.
The people who read or kept or wrote
Right.
the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Right, and let's keep in mind that there were books that were maintained in the Dead Sea Scrolls that had a wider provenance. In other words, like the same way that they read Genesis, right? They read Jubilees, and Jubilees seems to have applied not as widely, obviously, as Genesis, but Jubilees was read by a larger group than just this community.
So it wasn't a book they created, it was a book they used.
That's right.
Okay.
So anyway, going back to the Damascus document, which was one of their rule books, it talks about Belial misleading people.
Yeah.
Belial has traps for people, leading them to believe that the wrong law is the correct law. And this is the way that
Wow.
they can explain.
Wow.
It's the way that they can explain why does everyone not understand that we're keeping the right
That
law.
way, so we got to stop.
Yeah.
That's really a big concept, or it's an
Yeah.
important concept.
Yes.
In other words, you have this idea that in some of the prayers of the Dead Sea community that there's a demon inside me and he's causing me to sin, or he's tempting me to sin, maybe. Would you say
You're
that's
talking
fair?
about in the Dead Sea. Well,
In the prayers, there's a demon
Yeah.
inside me and it's causing me to sin somehow. But then here's a concept which is different.
right.
He's not
Exactly.
saying, eat pork because pork is delicious. He's saying, and maybe he doesn't say this exactly, but it's as if he said, eat pork because God didn't command you not to eat pork. Would that be fair to...
That would be...
He's
That's
deceiving
what
pe-
they're saying. Yes, they're
Wow.
essentially... He's deceiving
Wow.
them according to
about what the
law.
Torah is. And the
About
example
what
of
the
pork,
law
I
is.
just made that up. It's,
Right. But
it's
the-
probably things that are a lot more subtle than that.
They're a lot more subtle because they're going to be specific to the community or to
Wow.
others. So
So if
the
they have a certain rule...
calendar, for example.
Oh.
Okay, so
Can we talk about that?
We do have the one place that is closest
Mm-hmm.
to seeming to hint at something like demonic possession, but which still isn't demonic possession, is saying that there's a rule in the Damascus document where if someone keeps, it's hard for me to say it by heart. I hope I have a reference to it in here. I hope
She's
I
opening up
cite
her
it.
book.
Yes, I hope I cited it.
And I
don't
was
know if
I was looking at this
yes.
book before, and there's an index there that's like, I think it's 28 pages long, just of ancient references. Everything from Aristotle to the Dead Sea Scrolls to the Tanakh. She has a whole section on Romans chapter 7 in this book. I mean, or in the index there.
Yeah,
I mean,
and
wow.
in the book. It's not just
in the
in
book
the
too.
index.
I only went through the index. Okay. Wow. But this is really an
yeah.
interesting concept. So they had a calendar, which, and correct me if I'm wrong,
Yeah.
or your understanding. I know I'm not wrong, but if it differs from your understanding. So I'm familiar with the 364-day calendar, where every year began on a Wednesday and it's divisible by 7. Is that the calendar you're talking about?
Pretty
okay,
much.
and
So
then-
you have
and
a
then
calendar. And so they have a calendar.
So if someone
where-
doesn't follow that calendar, according to their theology, the reason that I follow a citing of the new moon calendar is because I've been deceived by Belial or something.
Well, that's the assumption. I mean, I think we can make that assumption. That's not one of the things that they cite as the 3 traps of Belial. The 3 traps of Belial that they
Okay.
actually talk about.
But hypothetically, that could be an
But
application.
hypothetically,
of
yes,
this.
absolutely.
Wow. What are
So-
the 3 traps of Belial?
The 3 traps of
According to the Dead
Belial
Sea
are the first is unchastity, the second wealth, and the third defilement of the sanctuary.
Okay.
And he who escapes from this is caught by that, and he who escapes from that is caught by this. And there are different explanations. They explain to a certain extent themselves what they mean, but it seems to be so for example, unchastity is explained as from what I remember, it's yes, here. The author explains that unchastity refers to the practice of taking more than one wife. And defilement of the sanctuary is connected to not separating, quote, according to the Torah, end quote, having relations with a woman during her menstrual period, and marriage between a man and his niece.
Okay, so let's just get a general
Okay, but
understanding here.
but you see, those
Yeah.
are specific
Right.
disagreements.
So basically, they
between
have
community and
they have a
others.
certain interpretation of the Torah, and they say all the other people who don't follow our interpretation, they think they're living a righteous lifestyle, but they've been deceived by Belial.
Right. And,
Wow.
and what that's explaining for them is how in the world can everyone not see that our laws are
That
the
we're
correct
just so
laws?
obviously
Yeah,
right.
we're so obviously right.
So it must be
It's got to be the work of a
Belial.
demon. Yeah.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
So you know what this reminds me of, and there's a specific example it reminds me of. Over at the Diaspora Museum,
Yeah.
there's a section on Jewish-Christian debates, and it shows a medieval Christian manuscript. And in the manuscript, it shows the Jew sitting there, and the demon comes and binds a veil, a blindfold over the Jew's eyes. And this is the way the medieval Christians understood. Why is it that the Jews don't see what's so obvious that, Christianity,
Yeah, so it's
Catholicism
just
is
like
correct?
that. It is just
So
it's the same sort of
so
concept.
this is the
It's
source
really,
of that,
yeah.
or at least an early iteration of that
Yeah.
concept.
Well, I mean, because
Wow.
we can think about whenever. I mean, I taught a course on angels and demons, and what I
Uh-huh.
like to ask is,
Yeah.
what purpose for both the angel and the demon?
Yeah.
Why do we have an angel here? Why do we
Uh-huh.
have a demon here?
Yeah.
What are they answering? What function are they fulfilling for us as readers, or as people praying, or as? So the quote I wanted to read in the Damascus document, there is a law that says each man whom the spirits of Belial rule. This is in Damascus document 12:226. Each man whom the spirits of Belial rule and speaks apostasy, in accordance with the judgment of one who communicates with a ghost or a familiar spirit, shall he be judged. In other words, he should be killed. And each man who errs and profanes the Sabbath or the holy days shall not be put to death, for he is to be guarded by the sons of man. And if he is healed of it, they shall guard
Of the
him.
demon. Is that
Right.
healed?
That's
Okay.
the idea. The idea
Wow.
seems to be that's what people think is, why is he not killed for profaning the Sabbath or the holy days? And they think it's possible that the reason they're saying, well, it's because spirits of Belial ruled him, is maybe the reason he profaned, quote unquote, the Sabbath or the holy days is because he was keeping a different calendar. The question is, well, what do you mean? But what about the Sabbath? How is that different?
Well, they had all kinds of specific rules.
They had specific rules.
Okay.
Well, it wouldn't just be specific rules of the community. The question is, if it were specifically calendrical rule, then perhaps he tried to bring a sacrifice on the Sabbath for one of the holy days. Because according to their calendar, a holy day doesn't fall on Sabbath, so you never have to bring an extra sacrifice on the Sabbath.
So next time I encounter somebody who has a different understanding of the Creator's calendar, can I say that they're possessed by Belial? Is that like a catch-all? I'm being facetious.
I never say. I never say. Whenever there's a question, I never say the answer is to be like a member of the Qumran community.
No,
that's never my answer.
I'm being facetious, but I think this is an amazing conversation, an amazing concept here. That these things that we're seeing later, I don't know, in medieval Christian texts and maybe in other places in the New Testament, that the Jews are deceived or blinded. That actually goes back to these ideas in the Qumran community.
Well, actually, the idea of being blinded specifically is a classic Hellenistic way of talking about someone.
Well, and even in Isaiah, you have things about the people of eyes, but they don't see, but it doesn't say anything about demons. So here they're being specifically misled or blinded by demons. Yeah. Wow. And
so, well, here they're not blinded. In the Damascus document, they're not blinded.
Well, I introduced that from the... They're being misled by some demon, by Belial or a demon.
Yeah, the idea... Yeah.
Wow. So, all right, so that's one explanation of sin. What's another...
So another explanation of sin is that people are created with an inclination to sin. Now, that's not that's an explanation. It's not a great reason, right?
And that's what we call in Judaism the Yetzer Hara.
Okay, so, right. So
is that right?
Okay, so yes and no, right? Because a lot of times if you in Orthodox Judaism say, oh, that's the Yetzer Hara, you're talking about a kind of...
And that's translated as the evil inclination.
Right. Okay. So when the rabbis are talking about it, the Yetzer Hara is depicted almost as this combination of an internal, like an explanation of your internal inclination, but in demonic terms. Okay. So they'll talk about how the evil inclination wants to kill you. You have to drag him down to the Beit Midrash and learn Torah. And that's how you... like. That's how you defeat him. But he wants you to sin. Yeah. But he wants you to sin, right? Okay. And when they talk about it in Second Temple literature, it's usually much closer. Or and there are people who've done studies where they only look at where it says evil inclination specifically. And sometimes they even made mistakes because there are places where it uses the word inclination, for example, in the prayer collection called the Hodayot, where it uses the word Yetzer, and what it means is simply a creation. So they'll call a person a Yetzer Basar, a creation of flesh. Right?
Well, and so, for example, the verse in Genesis where it says the nature of man's thoughts are evil from his youth, the word there is Yetzer.
Right.
But there it actually probably is equivalent to the word nature or something like that, or the way he was created. It's from Yetzar to form. Right. But here in later literature, it has a different meaning altogether.
That's right. So in the later literature, it becomes inclination, but not always. Sometimes it still means a creation.
Okay.
So you have to be careful when you're... Now, I looked at texts that were talking about something that was an internal inclination, but didn't use necessarily the word Yetzer. Okay. Right? So they say he went according to Shlilut Libo, which is the...
rebelliousness of his heart.
Right. Or they talk about his heart. Fourth Ezra talks about his evil heart. Right?
Okay.
So these are really talking about an evil inclination in different terms. But when we talk about the rabbinic evil inclination, it's closer to a demon. It's kind of a mix.
And isn't there a concept, as I recall from many years ago, that the evil inclination was blinded and that caused people to be, less inclined to commit idolatry, for example? Or is that just like a really later concept?
That's a much later idea. I mean, when you have, in general, so you have this idea in the Second Temple period about an evil inclination, which is just a part of the person. A part of the person wants to sin. And the question is, what is that? How do you characterize that? So, for example, Ben Sira talks about having an evil inclination. The Dead Sea Scrolls, when they talk about an evil inclination, talk about it in a couple of ways. One is that I am physical, and therefore I am sinful, which I need to point out here because anyone who's familiar with Christian thought is automatically going to go to the kind of spirit-flesh dichotomy. That does not exist in the Dead Sea Scrolls.
It doesn't exist.
It exists in Paul, of course. It's very prominent in Paul and Romans.
Does that exist in the Tanakh, as far as you understand?
That's a good question. I would say not in terms of sin necessarily. In other words, there's a question: can a person be? What I want to say is that in the Dead Sea Scrolls, a person is flesh. They can't just be spirit, and they can't. They're a fleshly spirit. They would say, "Ruach basar" is a term that they sometimes use.
Wow.
They're a fleshly spirit, And because of that, they have this kind of lowly nature, which is
Right.
connected to the
And-
physical,
and-
but
and-
you can't separate between the physical and the spirit.
So it's in the Tanakh. I know
It's all baked in the mix. You know?
well, right. In the Tanakh, I know it uses the word nefesh, soul, and it's talking about a person.
Right.
And there doesn't seem to be this idea that my nefesh can be completely disconnected from my physical body. Even the whole idea of resurrection, and maybe that's a big concept to talk about. But
Right.
it seems you are a soul and you have a body, not that your body is inhabited by this,
Right. That's right. That's right.
by this
It's
separate entity, the soul.
Right.
And,
Right.
Okay.
It's not.
So how does
the,
that play into the Christian idea in Paul specifically of a source of sin? Explain that for 'cause maybe
Okay. So it gets very complicated because Paul
Paul gets complicated. I'm shocked.
Yes. So Paul's kind of complicated. There are a couple of different ideas that don't show up so much in Second Temple literature and are very prominent in Paul. So, for example, this separation between spirit and flesh, where the idea is the sin is connected to the flesh, the sin is not connected to the spirit. I should just be spirit and leave my, all these, this
If I
real
can focus on
dichotomy.
the spirit, I won't have sin.
Right. I don't want to start interpreting Paul
Okay.
because there's so many interpretations of
Okay.
Paul. But this idea that I sin in that I am flesh, that's sort of dichotomy. There is that I sin in that I'm flesh, but not the same kind of dichotomy between spirit and flesh. So in the speaker of the Hodayot will talk about kind of being a spirit of flesh, or that, and the lowliness of being a fleshly mortal being. In Psalms we have more mortal. And in Hodayot, for example, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, we have more talking about being sinful because you're flesh, and therefore lowly, and how can I even speak to God?
Okay.
Right?
This has been absolutely fascinating. And just to summarize, really the big revelation here, the big idea that we talked about, I think, is that there's these, in Second Temple literature, there's two sources of sin. You can blame it on the demons. You can say the devil made me do it, or you can attribute it to some internal nature, internal characteristic of human beings.
Right. And I'd like to say that even when demons are brought in, you're not necessarily let off the hook by saying a demon made me do it. Just because a Belial may have misled you doesn't mean that you're not responsible.
And that would distinguish.
And realize that by saying Belial misled me, it's different from Belial coming in and affecting me.
And you're saying in the Gospels, the idea is they completely control you. You have no control, nothing you can do about it. You completely, is that what your understanding of the Gospels?
I don't want to, again, the Gospels are also complicated. They have different demons and different ways that they're interacting with demons. I'm just saying that the passages of the Gospels where there's a demon that's actually possessing a person completely physically, that's very unusual.
That's very different than what we see in the Dead Sea Scrolls.
What we see in Dead Sea Scrolls and in general in Jewish Second Temple literature. I'm not the only person to notice this, by the way.
Any last things about this topic you want to tell them?
Very quickly, the idea of whether the source of sin, kind of whether you could say something else made me do it, or whether I had complete free will. A lot of times in Second Temple literature, that's determined by the type of text. So, for example, when you're praying, it's much more likely to sound, like I said, deterministic, that someone made me do it, or there are these demons inside me, and I need God's help to resist them. Whereas in the introductions to rule books, even in the Dead Sea Scrolls, I want to emphasize this, even in the Dead Sea Scrolls, we think of them as a deterministic group, and in many ways they were. When they introduce the rules, they keep on, for example, in the Damascus document, it keeps on saying, choose. You need to choose God's will and reject. You have to reject your own will and choose God's commandments. And it says choose. It says the word choose several times. So choice is emphasized when we're talking about rules, even when it's a relatively deterministic group. And even when they're talking about demons, by the way.
So when we're praying, we say, look, I'm powerless, I need your help, I can't do it. But when I'm standing in front of that, I don't know, bacon, lettuce, and tomato burger, that's my choice. Is the way it's described in the literature. Thank you so much, Miriam. This has been an amazing discussion, Dr. Brand. Remember, you can go get the book on Amazon.com. It's called Evil Within and Without, The Source of Sin and Its Nature as Portrayed in Second Temple Literature by Miriam T. Brand.
Or you can take it out from your local library.
Buy the book. Shalom.
You have been listening to Hebrew Voices with Nehemiah Gordon. Thank you for supporting Nehemiah's Makor Hebrew Foundation. Learn more at nehemiahswall.com.